I will invite now the Dr. Christian Greco to come on the scene for the last conference of the day. So, Christian Greco has been director of the Museo Egizio di Torino since 2014. He managed a refurbishment of the museum building and a renovation of its galleries, completed on March 2015. Whereby the Museo Egizio was transformed from an antiquities museum into an archaeological museum. Trained mainly in the Netherlands, he is an Egyptologist with a vast experience working in museums. He curated many exhibitions and curatorial projects in the Netherlands, Japan, Finland, Spain, and Scotland. While at the head of the Museo Egizio, he has set up important international collaboration with museums, universities, and research institutes all across the world. Christian Greco is currently teaching courses in the material culture of ancient Egypt and museology at the University of Turin in Pavia, and he is visiting professor at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. Fieldwork is particularly prominent in Greco's curriculum vitae since 2011. He has been co-director of the Italian-Dutch archaeological mission at Saqqara. Greco's published records include many scholarly essays and writing for the non-specialist public in several languages. So this afternoon, he will talk to us about Salvolini Revisited, from Champollion pupil to independent scholar. So thank you, Mr. Greco.
Thank you. Let me see if I got this working. Apparently it doesn't want to work with me, so. Yes, here it goes.
This one.
Yes. Thank you. So we just heard about Salvolini, about the notice of 1842 by Champollion Figeac, and the, well, we could say that after that publication, the name of Salvolini has been forever in Egyptology be linked with the fact of plagiarism, and the fact he was accused by the brother of Champollion of having taken the notes, reused the notes for his publication, and actually made use of what he took before the death of, or soon after the death of Champollion in 1832. I would like to talk tonight about the amazing material archive that we have in Turin. The archive of Salvolini has been dispersed between the BNF, the State Archive in Turin, the Accademia delle Scienze, and the Italian National Library in Faenza. I would like to say something about this young chap who was born in 1809 and died in 1838, not even at the age of 29. What gets very interesting for us is what happens starting in 1830, when in July he comes to Turin. He gets to know Gazzera, who later will become a perpetual secretary of the Academy of Sciences in Turin. And by the end of August, on 29th of August, he reached Paris, where he started studying with de Saussure and Champollion, and he took advantage of being at the presence of Champollion in the last 2 years of his life. But I would like to start talking about Salvolini, bringing you to the Netherlands, because due to the fact of how archive works, after his death, his family sold his paper starting in 1814 to different archives, and we happen to have in Turin a major part of Salvolini archive, but is only very little related to our museum, but in the greatest part, it related to the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden. So I would like to bring you to Leiden first in order to understand the value what we have in Turin, attesting the scholarly activity of Salvolini, especially in the year 1834, when he visited for the first time Leiden. In Leiden, in 1818, a National Museum of Antiquities was established by this man, Casper Christian Reuvens, who in 1818 was fired from being professor at the Athenaeum in Harderwijk, and he was given the task by King William I to form a new museum. He managed to buy in Livorno, we heard yesterday by Alain Zivy how important Livorno was at this point, a collection by Anastasi, a Greek Armenian who was Consul General of Norway and Sweden, who had the monopoly of the trade of grain from the Baltic region. The major part of the collection, more than 6,000 objects, came from Memphis, and I just want to show you some of the beautiful reliefs coming from the tomb of Horemheb. Here you see Horemheb receiving the gold of honor, and the famous release with the prisoners brought in front of the king, who is represented here, and the king is King Tutankhamun and his wife. Not only Reuvens bought the Anastasi collection with major important pieces and reliefs coming from Saqqara, and since 1975, the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, first under the direction of Professor Jeffrey Martin, starting the excavations in Saqqara to give an archaeological background of the reliefs which were in Leiden. But Reuvens bought also 300 objects of the collection Chimba, among which there is also this piece coming from the tomb of Tutankhamun, of Horemheb. Just before dying, Reuvens in 1835 went to London because there was an auction for the second sold collection. Actually, he didn't manage to buy the sold collection for Leiden, but he managed to buy this amazing Book of the Dead papyrus of Kenna. Is one of the, you see the beautiful post-Amarna style of this papyrus, and he was actually so extremely clever in buying it. And we read in the diary written by his widow how the Englishman reacted when he managed to buy this papyrus, which was not bought by the British Museum. He cleaned it up, he opened, and it turned out to be what it is. And his wife wrote in Latin, mirati igitur sunt docti Angli qui bendizioni aderant, Reuvensium singularem sagacitatem and diligentiam. So the English men were extremely surprised by how cunning and diligent was Reuvens in recognizing the value of this manuscript and buying it. On his way back from London in 1835, he died. He was not able to talk anymore. They thought he was tired. His wife asked him to go and have a rest. But while he arrived in Rotterdam, he was completely paralyzed, and he died a few days later at age 40, leaving the Leiden Museum with a huge problem. There was no successor. And nobody was expecting that the young director who had put together the collection was about to die. And there was an immediate problem, a discussion which I will talk later on, who could succeed Reuvens. Lehmanns was the only one available. He was the pupil of Reuvens. He was working as a secretary at the moment at the museum, but anyway, he would become conservator in 1835, director in 1830 and remained director until 1891. And he will become at a certain point the Nestor of European Egyptologists. He was the one who had met the first generation of Egyptologists, not Champollion himself, but Salvolini, and I will tell you in a minute. And he managed the tradition, and he kept contact with everybody. It's very interesting how connected he was, for instance, with Rosellini, and how the two of them wrote very often concerning grammatical questions. If Reuvens was the one who put together the collection, Leemans was the one who published the collection. Le Monument Égyptien are one of the most important achievements that he did, because he published everything in color, in describing the monuments. And Leiden is one of the few museums that really has very few not attributed numbers, because even the small scarabs were all described and designed, and when you make an inventory check, it's very easy to attribute the right number to the right objects. You see here the wonderful heart scarab of Jehuti, but he, as I said, he drew everything from everyday objects to statues to jewelry, as we saw. In the archive in the museum in Leiden, we see also how he went about, for instance, with the first inventory number, Anastasia 1, of the statue of Maya. We see how he was just copying and making comments, and then coming to a full drawing, as we see here in this wonderful now for us, and the double statue of Maya and Merit, and the single statue of Maya. These are the plates published in the Monument Égyptien. In Turin, we have the complete documentation that Salvolini did in 1834, when he was invited by Reuvens to go to Leiden to document the collection, which was partially exhibited, partially was in the Orangerie, in the Botanical Garden, and we will come back to that in a minute. And actually, one of the tasks that Salvolini had was, during the day, to go to the collection, to open the crates and to document what he would find, and in the afternoon to teach hieroglyphs and what he had himself learned by Champollion to laymen. So we see, for instance, this very same inscription that we just saw with the Himiper Hajj Neptawi Maya. And, well, one by one, Salvolini documented all the title, wrote down the hieroglyphic inscriptions, made some notes, made some drawings, like this scene of Horemheb in front of Ra Orakti of the Chimba collection, but also went through all the alabaster vases, documented them. He was very intrigued by the cartouches, and so those are the vases that you just saw drawn. But he went about looking at the funerary cones, documenting the wonderful cubit that you see here, making assumptions concerning the iconography and the way signs were combined. We've seen this now for us, for instance, how he was puzzled by the presence of both in the naos of Osiris and of the jet pillar with the Ra above it. He took an incredibly interest in the stela. One by one, sometimes he made a facsimile, sometimes just a few notes, sometimes he made a very quick note documenting what he saw. Sometimes he didn't draw it as a stela, but just copied the text that we can find. And look at this beautiful Middle Kingdom stela of Hekahib, and wonderful documentation that he did in different parts, documenting the structure, making a facsimile, but also with sparse notes, trying to understand, making a rough translation, and commenting all on the time on the cartouches when they were present. And so one by one, the stela were documented, and the monuments were described. He had a lot of interest in a very important monument of Mary Mary from Saqqara. We know how important it is for the opening of the mouth ritual, and so he copied all the texts, he made subdivisions, he made some notes, he tried to copy the rough sketches of the reliefs and the scenes that were documented, and this is the final part of the text of Mary Mary that he copied, all of it himself, with all the lists of the funerary offers. Going through the monuments, of course, he stumbled upon, for instance, this wonderful relief coming from the Ramesside tomb of Tames, which was found back by Ola El Aghizi and Tarek Taufik in 2010, and which is such an important piece for Leiden. So he documented it, he made a drawing, we could say even, well, it's not a facsimile, but he copied the text and he made a careful drawing of what he saw. And as you probably know, this piece is rather important because it matches, it fits to this other relief on the left, which is now in the Liebig house, and it matches perfectly with a relief, the so-called Rounet relief, which is in the Cairo Museum. And so actually they all match together, and you can reconstruct a wall up to 2 meters 10. In Leiden, there are also the 4 wonderful pillars of Ptames with all his title. As you know, he was mayor of Memphis. And there is, among the papers that we have in Turin, a small folder dedicated to the pillars of Thomas himself, when he's wondering why there are only 4 and not more, why there are 3 figures looking to the left and 1 figure looking to the right. And then he copied them, he circled most of the time the titles and tried to understand what he found. He was very interested in this stela, of course, which is most of the time, by the way, make the work also very easy. He always puts the inventory number. So for us, it's extremely useful to see to which monument it corresponds. And what is also interesting is in this scene where Seth is trying to kill Apophis, it was so interesting to see how he tried to make a connection with other funerary decoration that he saw in papyri. This is, we could say, is the most complete documentation that we have of the Leiden collection, because it went through everything, the stela, the sarcophagi, the papyri that we have before Lehmann's Monument Egyptian. We can even say that Lehmann's was inspired in starting the Monument Egyptian after seeing how Salvolini went about. Here just the outer part of the decoration of the coffin of Chaufnate. So here just copied the text of the 12 hours. Then he made a rough drawing with some comments, because this is also what is quite interesting in his papers. Sometimes he tries to make a facsimile, sometimes it's just comment and make a rough drawing, and this is the wonderful coffin I'm referring to. And then his fascination for papyri. For papyri, here even had a different kind of working. The Book of the Dead Papyrus of Chahurit, he made a facsimile, but even here, as you see, there are parts which are facsimile and then notes which are brought up later. This is the scene he's been copying. This is some of the photograph of Chahurit, and then sometimes he just made notes on paper. He copied with 3 hands on paper, but then he inserted parts which were in facsimile. And he went back, he wondered what the translation could be, and he thought over and over again about the meaning of it. he was really puzzled by the papyrus of Paquerre, where he didn't make a facsimile except for this little scene. He was really puzzled by the Amduat, and there are pages of pages devoted to the Amduat papyri in Leiden, with an attempt of interpretation of what he was seeing. It's also quite interesting to see how he mingles different languages, because he goes from French to Italian to Latin, sometimes to Greek. And as I said, Amduat and the papyri of the Amduat in Leiden where is struck his attention. And so he came back, for instance, to the 12 hours of the Amduat and the beginning of it, trying to understand what he was seeing in the papyri. I already mentioned the papyrus of Paquerre, where he didn't do a facsimile, but just some drawings. It's difficult to understand how, when he would choose to do a facsimile, when he would just make a drawing, when he would just make some notes. We have to understand he remained in Leiden for 4 months. His intention at the beginning was, of course, not a full documentation of the collection, was just to see the monuments in Leiden and to understand whether these monuments could give him some more insight concerning the decipherment of hieroglyphs and what Champollion had taught him. And so here you see some of the scene represented, and sometimes what you even see that are just some sketches where it's very difficult to understand what it's actually talking about. And here we have, for instance, book quoted 39, is very interested in this kind of representation, and he made a couple of drawings of it. And then there was the copying of the papyri. All the hieratic papyri were copied, the Ramesside papyri were copied one by one. And what is incredibly interesting is that the papyri were still rolled up. He unrolled them and he drew the sealings, which in most cases now are lost. So they are a kind of interest. Underneath the hieratic, you see some notes. The notes are not a translation. The notes are just some comments concerning the cartouches. We can say that if Salvolini had an achievement, was one of trying to understand why a king would have different cartouches and how this different naming of the kings could work one next to each other, and how this could help in giving a development not only on the different appellatives, but to understand how this could work together and how a historical understanding of the succession of the kings could be said about. Sometimes he uses transparent paper just to make facsimile, while some of the times it's just hard paper where he copied by hard, as you see here. And here again, very interesting, there is this drawing of the ceiling. Among the papers that we have of Salvolini, there is this letter, which is not preserved in Turin, but it's in the National Library, in the State Library, actually, in The Hague, where we have a very negative comments that Salvolini, I have it, is in Italian, and I have a part of it, where Salvolini says that it's deplorable to see how the Leiden collection is kept, because, as I said, part of it was still in the Orangerie, so it was not exhibited. And he said that it would be a scandal for Europe to see where, in his heart, such important pieces will be destroyed by this is very interesting, by the Christian fanatism, and so the Christian fanatism being the Dutch, and the barbaric Islamic barbarism. So what Christian fanaticism and what barbaric Islamic barbarism has left intact could be destroyed in the very heart of Europe because people do not take care of this collection. Actually, this note is very important because this note went to Thorbecke. Thorbecke was professor of history in Leiden. He had been a pupil, PhD student of Reuvens. Later, it would become one of the most important statements in the Netherlands and is the father, we could say, of the parliamentary constitution in the Netherlands. And Thorbecke, when he received this note, he understood that something had to happen to the museum, that a new building had to be at disposal of the museum. At that moment, for those of you who know Leiden, there was a small museum in the Breestraat, and then they moved to the Rappenburg, where it is nowadays. There was also a brief discussion whether the museum should go to Amsterdam. And now we come to Thorbecke. I go from Italian to Dutch, but don't worry, I translate it. There is this letter on the 22nd of October, 1835, when Thorbecke says, concerning the professorship of layman's, so can you imagine, Reuvens just died and they have to have a successor. And concerning the museum, there are two things he's concerned about. So he says it's not necessary that just a normal administrator of the museum gets the honor of such a title, which has the highest scientific value that a government can give, and that it doesn't need to be a throwaway to people who do not have any capacity and do not are not able to do anything in their fields. As far as the museum is concerned, why haven't we tried to ask a man as Salvolini and putting him at the head of this place, because we could have at least a certainty that it could build something what now is only dust. In November 1835, there is another letter of Thorbecke where he says, we shouldn't be worried about what we do now. Maybe we shouldn't take a decision. So he's really concerned that layman's could become director. Just give him 1 or 2 years, pay him 500 or 600 guilders. And in the meantime, with the money that we save, because we don't pay him as much as we paid Reuvens, we could try to find somebody else more capable, like Salvolini. And because I wish, says Thorbecke, that we have a real director of the museum, not a guardian of a mummy. And again on the 4th of November, 1835, and again, Thorbecke says, I don't know Salvolini myself, having met him. I haven't even seen him. But I can say something about him because I have been talking about him by the scholars like Hamacher, Reuvens, Bakken, and Geel, and people with whom he was entertaining himself while he was in Leiden. I heard them saying and speaking about his talent and being very impressed about what he could do. From there, I can assume that if we could give this job to Salvolini, he would do in 2 or 3 years what Reuvens did in 10. So that was the first thing I thought when I was in Dresden and I heard of the death of Reuvens, and the only person I could come up with for the directorship was Salvolini. Actually, if we think of him, well, the death of Reuvens could be even an advantage for us. Even though at the moment it seems to be so bad, if we have somebody like Humbert of Leemans who take care of the administration, later on we could have a real director. This is 1835. As we heard before, the note of Champollion Figeac in 1842, of those papers were subtracted and then found back in 1840s, of course, was published in 1842. But already there were rumors about the role of Salvolini. There were people wondering, especially in France, whether he was somebody to be trusted or whether he was just taking advantage and repeating what his professor was telling him. Silvia Naudi just published the 48 letters housed at the Academy of Science in Turin. And in these 48 letters, there is back and forth a correspondence between Salvolini and Gazzera, who was the perpetual secretary of was at the time of the Academy of Sciences, and Peyron. And Gazzera was doing whatever he could to ask Salvolini to come back to Turin and to become director. He even asked to get in touch with Saluzzo, a nobleman, in order to have somebody to liaise with the king, Carlo Alberto, to see whether he could publish his manuscripts, dedicating them to Carlo Alberto himself. Gazzera was really willing to have him come into Piedmont and even ask him to start the procedure to be naturalized as a citizen of Piedmont. At that time, Italy was not unified. He was coming from Faenza. Faenza was part of the Pope state, and in order to become director of the Turin Museum, he had to become a citizen of Piedmont. It's interesting to see in the letters back and forth that at a certain point, Salvolini himself says that he doubts about what he should do. He says, how can I go on trying to write a grammar? How can I go on building up on what I've learned from my teacher? And Gazzera tells him, well, this is science. Everybody learn something, and there is the greatest pride for a teacher to see his pupil that can build upon what he has learned and to go any further. But what is interesting is that in 1838, Leumans wrote his first publication, and his first publication is a lettre à Monsieur Salvolini. And in the first chapter, he says that he hears that there are rumors. So he writes this, his first publication, of course, publishing part of the collection in Leiden, dedicating it to Salvolini because he was struck by the sudden death of Salvolini in 1838. In 1838, he died because of tuberculosis. And the last letter that Salvolini sent to Gazzera was in 1837, so we know that the last few months were very heavy for him. Well, Lehmann says, I heard that there are rumors about Salvolini, but I cannot believe them because I used to keep a notebook every day because Salvolini stayed at Lehmann's house in just outside Leiden. He said when in the evening, after supper, we would sit apart and Salvolini would teach me hieroglyphs. I would keep notes of them. And in my notebook, I had written grammar taught to me by Salvolini. And one day, by chance, Lehmann writes, Salvolini saw this notebook and he corrected it and he put grammar written by Champollion because he said, there is no way I can teach you something which is not mine. What I'm teaching you is just what I've learned by Champollion. What do we have, what other documents do we have in Turin? Well, we have this wonderful facsimile of, so the first complete facsimile of the papyrus of Youth Ang, papyrus which will be studied in the 30s of the 19th century by Carl Richard Lepsius, who understood, who named it the Book of the Dead, and who made a subdivision in 165 chapters. And here, look at some of the wonderful facsimile that we have of Youth Ang. And by the way, it's even interesting because in the folder that contains it, as I said, in the 40s, so after his death, his brother Gasper starting selling some of the notes. and probably didn't understand what it was dealing about. So in the folder is written papyrus of Leiden, which of course is not of Leiden. This is the papyrus of Ankh, which we have in Turin, which opens the exhibition. In the State Archive, we also have some notes, and it's interesting because we have different notes, some by Champollion of the royal canon, but some by Salvolini, with sometimes facsimile when doing sketches and going back and forth as he used to do. Then we also have an old folder concerning the Salier papyri, because he went to Provence to try to convince King Carlo Alberto to buy the Salier papyrus, and he produced, he was about to produce a documentation. So these are the notes of the Salier papyri as we have them in Turin. In the last letter from Gazzera in 1837, we read, beside Gazzera being worried about his illness, whether he is proceeding on the publication of the obelisks from Luxor. Salvolini says that he's not working on that on the moment because he's simply not feeling well enough because of the tuberculosis. He's insisting having this heavy pain on his chest that makes him impossible to breathe. On the personal notes, it's also interesting to see how he goes back and forth about what he should do in his life, whether he should remain in Paris. He wants to stay in Paris as well. If I want to have a career as an Egyptologist, I should stay here because here I have a chance to study. But then he regrets about the climate. He misses a more mild climate, so sometimes he would like to go back to Italy, but he simply cannot make up his mind. Well, we have some notes on the obelisks and some extensive note, some considerations and going back and forth in Italian and Coptic. And then we also have some notes on the Rosetta Stone. It was Gazzera again and again tried to convince him to come to a full publication of the Rosetta Stone with his consideration, going back from what Champollion has done, but then re-elaborating with new theories. Gazzera writes to him that would be the chance to have the position of director in the museum in Turin if it could come to a publication and if it could dedicate it to Carlo Alberto, the King of Sardinia. The King of Sardinia, in the meantime, paid him 12,000 lira, which he used to publish one on his books. He published 300 copies, and then he wished that those copies would come to Turin in the Academy of Sciences, and they could be distributed. In 1837, the Academy of Science named him correspondent member in the same year where Ippolito Rosellini was also made correspondent members. Yesterday, Alain Zavy was telling us about how isolated life those scholars had, and sometimes also how difficult their character was. Well, Salvolini was for certain not an easy person. He hated deeply Rosellini. He thought that Rosellini was absolutely incapable of carrying on the work and publishing the journey they'd done in Egypt together. He had met Rosellini before going to Paris. He studied Oriental Studies in Bologna. He went a few months to Pisa, and he was completely disappointed by Rosellini. According to him, he had no knowledge whatsoever of grammar. But in those years when he was in Paris, actually he met everybody. Many people went to him because before this rumor came out, and I'm not going into whether the plagiarism attack is right or not. It's not the what I want to say tonight. I just want to present the material that we have. But in those years, he met everybody. Barucchi, who will then become director of the museum. Barucchi was sent by Gazzara there. He was just a professor of ancient history at the University of Turin, and he was sent to Paris to meet with Salvolini to learn hieroglyphs from Salvolini. He remained in touch till the very end with the Saucy, from whom he received advice, because he was constantly making comparisons, not only with Arabic, but was also very interested in Sanskrit that he had learned from the Saucy. He met von Humboldt in Berlin, and he said that Passalacqua was very good in exhibiting objects, but he understood nothing of philology. As I said, he was not an easy person. I mean, if you read his letter, we can understand that he made enemies then, but even now, his judgment of all the colleagues is very, very severe. He was even asked why he met von Humboldt, whether it could be interesting to go to Berlin. He went to Berlin, but to stay there and to document the monuments. He was impressed by the way that the museum in Berlin looked like, and he said that it was the best museum in Europe. Here again are some of the notes on the Rosetta Stone, and both on the hieroglyphs and also on the demotic, where he came back and very often he tried to make a translation in Greek. In the same years, he published a book about the origin of the Etruscan language, a book about the functioning of Latin and Greek. So he was very active even in the discipline. In recent years, Flavio Merletti took the task of documenting completely what is kept in Faenza, all the letters. As I said, Silvia Einaudi published for the Academy of Sciences the letter that are kept, the 48 letters of correspondence between Salvolini and all the different scholars. And we are planning in the museum to have a complete publication of the material related with the collection in Leiden that we house. The attempt is not to prove whether Champollion Figeac was right or wrong. The attempt is to understand how at the very beginning of Egyptology in 1834, he went to Leiden, he studied the collection, he tried to document it, he formed in hieroglyphs the person who would be director for 51 years, and apparently he made a very good impression in the highest part of the society. His merit is to have approached the problem that a collection also needs to be housed in a proper building, and that having papyri housed in the orangerie would mean the end of it. His merit was to try to understand and document as much as he could, and he was really willing. That's really is what you can see reading all the letters, and I read all the letters about his willingness to learn, his curiosity, his fully respect of his master, that he always and never criticized, and actually he tries to defend, even there is against those who criticize somehow Champollion. And on a personal note myself, I find a very tragic life that he had. He died when he was 29. He was supposed to be called and work in Leiden, but it never happened. There was a moment where from 1843, 1834, where he could even have the ambition to have a place at Collège de France. And then in the correspondence, we see that through Saluzzo, even the king of Sardinia was very interested First, to appoint him director, then to offer him a place as a professor of Egyptian language at University of Turin, something that never happened because he just died when he was 29. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. It was really fascinating. Is there some question in the room? So like the other presentation, you have the micro there, and I can read the question for the Zoom public. So yeah. For now, I have no question on Zoom, so you can go talk them.
I want to say that it's a fascinating presentation by Christian Greco, which opens mind to new ways, new paths. For me, of course, with Saqqara, the link for you, I understand what you can feel, your connection with the Dutch, with Leiden, with Torino, and we all repeated like a good pupils that Salvolini was bad man who made plagiat, which is a horrible thing. And now we don't know, as you say, because he has a complicated character.
Very
so
complicated.
Very difficult to, but his work is absolutely fascinating. And this fantastic Maya, Mary, for me, of course, Saqqara is this link, so old. This facsimile is writing, and sometimes it looks like Champollion himself, the writing, it's absolute. So you open really something new which needs more study and all that. I hope, of course, if it could be rehabilitated, if he deserves it, I hope it would be good. If not, anyway, yes, fantastic work.
Exactly.
At 29, before 20.
Yes, and when he went in Leiden, he was, let me see, 25.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's why I wanted to present the work of Leiden, because this, for me, what we have in our archive, I find it quite interesting because 1834, Champollion was dead. So I don't go on the notes of the Rosetta Stone. I mean, that would need very careful study. But then he was alone in Leiden. Champollion was not there, and he went through all the stele, the papyri.
Even the Collège de France was possible for him. It was Europe, but another, of course, the Europe of the scholars, the Europe of science. And so we can be grateful to this event and now here in Montreal for your lecture. For me, and I'm sure that a lot of people who are connected with all these questions, it's not only Champollion, not only history of Egyptology, it's archaeology, Saqqara. I think I mean, as you see, I have been really impressed. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to know either there is some archives in Champollion papers related to Salvolini and an appreciation of Salvolini work or something like that.
There are two letters, two notes, late in 1832, where Champollion really appreciates Salvolini. But you know, the trick is, and I think, I mean, a serious study should be devoted to is what happens after 1832, and what happens with those notes. He keeps the notes. Because probably there was a trust between the two of them, and how much this has influenced his way of thinking. On the other hand, so there is this very nice book. It's now only in Italian, published by Silvia Naudi, with the nice introduction of Professor Roccati, who also says, well, anyway, even from the published work of Salvolini, we see that it goes further, for instance, for the naming of the pharaoh. So, you know, this stigma of plagiarism is horrible, and I think nobody can take it off his shoulder. But if you also see in the published work that it goes further, I think, and I'm really, you know, I kind of feel, Alain, you said I was passionate about that, but because I feel it's something personal, not to rehabilitate him, but I think it's my duty to publish completely this archive, because my life crossed 200 years later his life. I was in Leiden when I came to Turin, but my life has been much more, I was much more lucky than he was. And I would like anyway to publish completely all the papers with the comments, so that anyway the scholarly work see what he did in 1834 completely independently. And I'm really touched, and this is published, of course, Le Lettre à Monsieur Salvolini by Leymans is something that really touches me anyway, because he reacts immediately in saying this is not possible because it was my teacher and I saw how he handled. And he had a double personality, it could even be, but...
Perhaps Vanessa could answer. There is some paper related to Salvolini in the paper in the...
Alors, in the paper of BNF by Champollion himself, I can't remember anything, but I used to read something that Salvolini was the favorite pupil of Champollion, and that's why Champollion used to give him paper. And no, I can't remember anything.
It's also very interesting because at the BNF, among the Salvolini papers, I mean, that's how you have a copy of the Golden Mile Papyrus and of the plan of the tomb of Ramses IV by Salvolini, which is there. I mean, but that's also because his family just scattered the archive all around. So it's also interesting to see how incredibly all this paper from Leiden, so in Turin is quite funny because all what we have in the State Archive is related to Leiden. There is only a little part related to Turin and more is in the BNF. So. Yeah.
When Jacques, yes, we have in the paper of the BNF some copy of the papyrus Salier, and it would be nice to compare the two copies to see if there are two different hands or not.
Yeah.
For sure, the Salier you have from Salvolini, because when Jacques Joseph used to pick up some paper from Salvolini's one, I think he made some mistake, and maybe there are some papers Salvolini
yes,
in the
exactly.
Champollion
Yes,
now,
absolutely.
and he left some Champollion's inside Salvolini's volumes. But sometimes they are mixed. You know, there's a copy by Champollion and they're annotated by Salvolini. It's a very complicated stories, and as he was his student, maybe Champollion just correct some things.
I think it would be very useful. We just finished digitize everything to compare the papers that we have and that you have. We managed to recognize slightly difference in writing on the royal canon. So we put apart what we think is Champollion and what is Salvolini, but it would be good if our one is already accessible, but if we set up also a kind of joint program, because I have exactly the same impression that also that you have, that among those notes which were taken by Champollion Figeac, there were also notes of Salvolini.
That would be nice because the handwriting of Salvolini is a nightmare to decipher. Champollion is very easy.
Yes,
to
it is, and also it is a nightmare to decipher the handwriting. And sometimes it's a mix of languages as well. So this, even when you decipher it, you're not there yet.
Oh, just something also funny in a way, the comparison with Champollion. I mean, when you see what Salvolini did about all these objects from Saqqara New Kingdom, moreover, and this fantastic work, and Champollion during the trip, when you remember in Egypt, he said it was not very positive about Saqqara, at least. It's La Plaine des Momies, and he says, I think he wrote, c'est un site perdu pour la science. It's lost for science. And in some time, you have Salvolini, of course, he was there, but it was not Saqqara the main. Salvolini wanted to see more and more inscriptions, but yeah. I mean, this is really funny because in this way, for the teacher and pupil,
and yes, different point of view,
the difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much.